Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone, from wherever you are joining. Welcome to the next series of videos for the CSA Cloud Control Metrics, which is going to be on the domain of interoperability and portability. My name is Akash Verma, and I work in the continuous assurance engineering org of Google Cloud. And what that basically means is my role and responsibility is to make sure that we, as a cloud service provider, whatever the controls that we have 24/7 365 view of, I would say, continuous controls monitoring over all our security and privacy controls. So the agenda for this particular set of video is going to be around 5 key areas. We're going to talk a little bit about what Cloud Control Metrics version 4 is. We're going to have a quick overview of that. What is the IPY domain and what controls does it consist of? What are the shared security responsibility model or the shared security responsibilities between a cloud service provider and a cloud service customer? Some of the security implementation best practices, along with some of the risk and why we need to apply those best practices to mitigate those risks. And ultimately, we're going to look into the key conclusions for this particular domain. So as everybody might have seen in all the previous videos, right? What is Cloud Control Metrics? So the Cloud Control Metrics is the only cloud security meta framework across the globe. It's a research-driven standard, which is basically driven by the cloud customers, providers, and assurance professionals. It simplifies the approach of implementation, assessment, and compliance across all cloud service providers that you might be using. It's aligned and mapped to the global regulations and also the industry standards and framework. A good example can be a NIST SP 800-553 or NIST CSF. It delineates the security responsibility between the cloud service provider and customers, and which a very, very impactful publication that we have around this is the CSA CCM Shared Security Responsibility Model Guide. It also provides a service delivery model applicability where each of the control is divided between the SaaS, PaaS, or infrastructure as a services, and how each of the controls applies to each of these service model. And the backbone of the CSA, I would say CSA, CCM is kind of the backbone of the CSA STAR program that not only assesses, but also provide a validity of the certification and assessment comparison between all cloud service providers. So the CCM version 4 framework basically consists of 10 components. The first one is the controls applicability metrics. The other one is the implementation guidelines, which tells about, hey, how to implement those controls. Then we have the core set of controls. The next one is the cake. Then we have the auditing guidelines telling about how each controls can be audited. Then we have the CCM Lite, or what we call as the foundational controls. Then we have the SSRM guidelines, which is basically the delineation between the shared security responsibility between the cloud service provider and the cloud service customers. Then the mappings to different industry standards and regulations, the gap analysis and addenda, and ultimately the CCM metrics if you want to do a continuous controls monitoring on those controls. So the CCM version 4 security domain basically consists of 17 security domains, and those 17 security domains consist of a total of 197 controls. So the first security domain is around audit and assurance, which basically talks about what kind of controls does a CSP and CSC should have for an effective audit and assurance program. The second domain is around application interface security. The third domain is around business continuity management and operational resilience, talking about, hey, how can we come quickly back from the disaster and what kind of continuity planning and management we can have. The fourth one is around change control and configuration management. The fifth one is around encryption and key management, how to encrypt, how to manage the keys, which is helping you encrypt your data. The sixth one is around data center security. The next one is around data security and privacy itself. The next one is around governance, risk management, and compliance, and how to govern your entire cloud security program, how to perform risk management, and what kind of compliance management you need to look after your cloud security program. The next one is the human resource security. Then comes identity and access management in cloud. Then comes interoperability and portability, which is the IPY domain. We're going to talk further during this series of video. Then comes infrastructure and virtualization security. Then comes logging and monitoring, security incident management, supply chain management, threat and vulnerability management, and universal endpoint management. And if we look into all these 17 security domains, the three pillars that I think all these security domains encompasses are control applicability and ownership. Okay, how is this control applicable to the cloud service provider versus cloud service customers, and who is the owner would be for that particular control in that particular domain. Then the architecture relevance around the cloud stack components, and then ultimately the organizational relevance. Hey, is this control relevant to my organization? Now, going further into the IPY domain. So one of the key risks that we see whenever we use a cloud service provider is vendor lock-in, right? And interoperability and portability domain basically, and the controls basically help us kind of mitigate this top risk, which is vendor lock-in. According to one of the studies done by Bain and Company, 2/3 of CIOs would like to use public cloud services from several different cloud service providers. However, 71% of the companies standardize on one CSP, and remaining 29% use multiple vendors, but they still spend on an average 95% of cloud budget on one CSP. And this data basically shows us that, hey, how much a cloud service customer rely on a single party. And with the IPY domain and the IPY controls, what we are basically trying to do is highlight this risk. And by the implementation of these controls, we want to make sure that if a company want to move from one CSP to the other CSP, they should not be logged in. There should be no trouble in moving from one CSP to the other. And then the transition should be very smooth, quick, and easy. So the CCM IPY domain basically consists of 4 control specifications to address the inherent risk of vendor lock-in. The first one is around IPY policies and procedures. And what it basically means is that each cloud service provider and each cloud service customers should have an established, documented, approved, and well communicated policies and procedures that fulfill the requirements, and should have the requirements around the communication between application interfaces, information processing around how the information is being processed, and how it can have an interoperability, application development portability, and around information and data exchange, so that the information, in a case if the application and data needs to be moved from one CSP to the other, there are well documented policies and procedures so that a team can follow step-by-step requirement from moving from one CSP to the other. And the key point over here is all these policies and procedures should be reviewed and updated at least annually. The second control is around application interface availability, and that basically means that the cloud service customers should be aware about what kind of application interfaces are being provided by the cloud service providers, so that they can programmatically retrieve their data, and which ultimately enables the interoperability and portability. The third control is around securing the IPY management, and what it basically means is what kind of the cryptographically secure and standardized network protocols that can be managed and implemented so that there is a secure exchange of the import and the export of the data, or the exchange of the data. And then the last one is around data portability contractual obligation. And what that it means is when a cloud service customer sign a contractual obligation with a cloud service provider and vice versa, each contract should include at least how and what kind of data format is going to be in terms of a contract termination. Again, for the contract termination, what is the length of the time the data will be stored with the CSP, scope of the data retained and made available to the cloud service customers, and what is the data deletion policy of the cloud service provider. Now, talking about the shared responsibility model, right? Like what is the shared responsibility between a cloud service provider and a cloud service customer for the IPY domain? So if you look into the delineation of the responsibilities between a CSP and CSC, for this particular domain, the CSPs are typically responsible for implementing a standardized communication protocol, ensuring those communication channels are secure, maintaining the cross-platform compatibility, standardize the data formats, and common data processing and data exchange protocols need to be established by a CSP. Whereas on the other hand, the CSCs are responsible for understanding what kind of tools and what kind of protocols are provided by the cloud service providers for making sure that they have secure data backups, transfer and restoring programs and processes, including using the interoperable data encryption. The CSC also need to understand the management, monitoring, and reporting of these interfaces provided by the CSPs and the integration of those interfaces among multiple ecosystem. And if we talk about, hey, what is the joint responsibility between those, between the CSP and a CSC? So both CSP and CSC are jointly responsible for documenting data portability contractual obligation, such as defining data ownership and migration procedures. And this becomes very, very handy when it comes to the breakage of the contract, when the contract is getting expired or if the CSC needs to move from one CSP to the other. This particular requirement becomes very, very key and very, very important. So now we're going to look into the security implementation best practices, which we're going to compare about for each of the control, what are the top risks and what are the top control implementation best practices that can help us mitigate those inherent risks. So if you look into the first control, which is IPY policies and procedures, right? Like the top key risk that we can think about over here is, hey, non-compliance and ineffective communication. Non-compliance in a sense that policies may become outdated, leading to non-adherence to the current standards and regulation. And as we know, compliance is one of the key areas in any InfoSec program. So we definitely need to make sure that we have mitigating controls for this particular risk. The second one is ineffective communication. Poor communication can result in stakeholders not understanding or following policies and procedures properly, which again, in terms of when somebody or a company needs to move from one CSP to the other, and if there are no well-documented policies and procedure, it becomes very, very hard, and it becomes quite challenging to make sure that all the steps have been performed really well. So few of the control implementation best practices for these risks are establish the clear policies and procedures, regularly review and update governance documentation, ensure communication channels are effective, and involve relevant stakeholders in policies and procedures lifecycle. For the second control, which is around the application interface availability, a few of the risks that we can think about are inadequate API security, lack of API standardization, and poor documentation. And what these three risks can do is, hey, APIs without proper security measures can lead to unauthorized access and data breaches. Lack of standardization, again, can hinder in interoperability, and poor documentation, as we said, inefficient or outdated API documentation can lead to misuse and also the implementation errors. Some of the control implementation best practices to mitigate these risks are using secure and standardized APIs, provide accurate and updated API documentation, and regularly test APIs for security and functionality. So the third control, which is around secure IPY management, few of the risks that we can think about are data breaches during data transfers, usage of weak cryptographic protocols, and inconsistent encryption practices. And all these three risks are basically trying to say that, hey, when your sensitive data is being transferred, you need to make sure that you're not using weak cryptographic protocols and you have good encryption practices, not only around encryption, but also around the key management, so that you have a secure data transfer. Some of the control implementation best practices for these risks are implementing strong encryption protocol, regularly updating your cryptographic standards, ensuring secure key management and certification renewal, and conducting regularly security audits for your cryptographic program. The fourth control is around data portability contractual obligation, and this again basically is kind of related to audit and assurance world, but this is very, very specific in terms of data transfer. And the key risk that we can think about over here is data loss and corruption during the transfer. Hey, if something like that happens, who is responsible for it? Unclear data retention is basically if you decide to move from one cloud service provider to the other, what are the chances that the CSP might still be retaining your data? Do we have clear requirements in our contracts around those? And non-compliance of data deletion requirements, which is basically failure to meet the data deletion policies, which can have regulatory breaches or can have data protection issues for any cloud service customers. So some of the control implementation best practices that can help us mitigate these risks are defining clear data formats and retention period, ensuring comprehensive data deletion policies, provide tools and support for data export and transfer, and conduct regular reviews of contractual obligations and ensure compliance with data portability and deletion standards. So finally, conclusion. So the conclusion shown over here, I think, is a common theme between all the CSA CCM domains. I think these set of conclusions are not unique to IPY domain, but it kind of applies to all the domains that we have been looking so far, and we're going to look ahead of the IPY domain. And what that basically means is we need to implement the controls for the first time or need to improve on the existing implementation. We need to make sure that we leverage CCM mappings to guide the implementation of controls across multiple frameworks. And what it's going to do is it's going to help the cloud service customers to implement the control once and show the compliance to multiple regulations, multiple industry standards, multiple frameworks in a single shot. We need to understand and delineate the security responsibilities and the control implementation between a cloud service provider and a cloud service customers. We need to identify the most effective best practices to include as provision within the organizational security policies. We need to make sure that we are able to translate cloud security best practices into the contractual provisions with the cloud service providers. And we need to make sure that we leverage and implement CCM controls with a specific cloud platform or architectures so that it helps to increase not only the security of our cloud ecosystem, but it also helps to improve the maturity of our cloud security ecosystem. So thank you for joining me in this IPY domain series of video. If you have any question on the IPY domain or any of the other domains within the CCM, please feel free to contact the working group program manager, Lefteris. Lefteris is an awesome guy. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact CSC support at support@cloudsecurityalliance.org. And as you can see, we have also given and pasted over here the 3 hyperlinks that can help you not only get the CCM metrics version 4, but also the implementation guidelines, the CCM Lite and Cake. Again, thank you very much for joining me in the IPY domain. This is Akash Verma, and I'm looking forward to meeting and talking to you if you have any questions. Thank you.